So what is a constitutional entrepreneur? Well, I was on stage here recently, actually in Dallas, Texas, with about 1,000 entrepreneurs, and I made a statement that actually resonated with the group. And I basically said this in a nutshell. Here's what I said: that we cannot allow elected officials that have never owned a business to dictate how entrepreneurs run theirs. And I wasn't anticipating a standing ovation on it, but I got one. And that's really why I ran for office. It's why I began this process, because as an entrepreneur, there is a certain way to think about things. There are a certain way that we go about things. And most elected officials just they've never owned a business, so they don't process that information the same way.
Yeah. In one of our conversations, which I think is brilliant, man, I got goosebumps while you were talking about that, especially as I pay taxes or I have to find out new regulations and rules and all this stuff. Like, man, it would be great to have people who are creating the rules have experience on how the rules actually affect me, the business owner, in the end. But in one of our conversations, Ryan, you said something that really stuck with me, something that you're building, and maybe you could share a little bit about it. A constitutional entrepreneur. It stuck with me. I wrote it down. What the heck is a constitutional entrepreneur?
Well, Josh, it's real simple. Let me back up. In 2019, I was asked to run for U.S. Congress here in Central Florida. It's the first political race that I'd ever been a part of. I had exited a couple of businesses that I had really been building since my early 20s. So 25-year run of being an entrepreneur. And I decided to run for U.S. Congress. And of course, I didn't win the race. However, learned a lot from it. There was thousands of conversations. Congressional race, there's a lot going on. It was basically full-time political through August of 2020. And people started asking me at the end of the race, Ryan, what did you learn? What did you learn? What did you learn? It's a common question. Still get it today. And one of the thoughts that came out of that was, out of the thousands of conversations that I'd had, literally hundreds of in-depth conversations, I started to notice that the people that owned businesses that I was talking to processed things that were going on in the news differently than the people that didn't own businesses. Now, I don't want to say that all the people that didn't own businesses were bad people, because they weren't, and many of them agreed with things that I would be talking about. But the reality is they process things different. See, when an entrepreneur that has owned businesses for years wakes up in the morning and they have to basically fight for their food, they have to go make something happen, or their family doesn't eat. They become over time, they become very solution oriented. They see a problem, they go after fixing the problem, because if they don't fix the problem, they go out of business. And they learn how to think that way. And of course, when they hear things going on in the country and in the news, most entrepreneurs are like, well, why don't we just do this? Why don't we just do that? Why don't we fix this? Why don't we fix that? Where there's a generation, and there are people that are conditioned that maybe are more employee minded. And by the way, you can be entrepreneurial minded and be an employee, but there are employee only minded people that wake up in the morning thinking, well, what's my boss going to do for me today? How much more can I get today? What can the government do for me today? And so they hear the same exact problems in the news and they process them differently. And I started calling myself, people ask me, listen, what'd you learn the most? I learned that I am a constitutional entrepreneur. I believe that our country was founded by entrepreneurs, that our country was written by entrepreneurs, and that there's entrepreneurial, godly principles woven in the fabrics of the foundation of the United States. And the more we deviate from those principles, the more we elect people that have never owned businesses. Again, it doesn't mean they're all bad people. They just don't process entrepreneurial thoughts the same way. And our country is founded on entrepreneurialism, if that's the word, entrepreneurialism. That's a long word.
Yeah.
But our country was founded on these principles. And, as we deviate from them, we create a major conflict here in the United States, because we're such an entrepreneurial country. And that's really what a lot of the fight is all about. It's about how we're dealing with things and how we're getting things done.
Yeah. So if we go back to when the Constitution was being written, it was written for a time period where the majority of those people sitting around signing their name were entrepreneurs. They knew that if they did not go close the deal or do the transaction or sell their widget or gidget, they and their family didn't eat. So that was the mindset of the crew sitting around that table. Is that right?
Well, 100%. I mean, to the point where they were, when I think of them, you have to think of the word hero when you think of our founding fathers, because they were all in. They were all in. I mean, they knew if it didn't work, they were dead. It doesn't get any more all in than that, right?
Yeah.
And so, in the United States today, in the business world today, it's usually not, hey, I'm going to start this business or I'm going to die. So it's not that deep of a mindset. But when the founders of this country went all in, they that's who they were. They were all in every area of their life. 99% of the country at that point worked for themselves, produced for themselves, and maybe 1 to 3% were employees. Well, today it's flipped. There's a small percentage of relatively business owners in the country compared to employees. And the country has flipped on that side, but the entrepreneurial spirit hasn't. And what drives us, what's made us number one, is that entrepreneurial spirit here in the US, the principles we were founded on. So the people that are still entrepreneurs don't want to mess with that, because why would you want to mess with what created you to be number one?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to, I guess, a entrepreneurial or constitutional entrepreneur, if we remove constitution from that, how does that impact people like me who own multiple businesses, and if I don't produce, my family doesn't eat. So like, what happens when the Constitution comes under attack? And we saw that maybe in 2020 and in a few years after. Like, what happens when the Constitution doesn't support entrepreneurs?
Well, we're no longer the United States as we know it. It's a different definition. And there are people that want to change the definition of the United States. They, in my opinion, want a different country. And certainly they have the right to move to a different country, but they certainly want to change what this country is. And so the idea of this topic set, constitutional entrepreneur, is to bring to light some of those principles that are being attacked, why we need to, support them, stick with them for the fabric and the greatness of our country, but really just to have some discussions, because there's a lot that we can learn from talking about, modern news and how it layers over constitutional entrepreneurial principles.
Now let's get pretty specific on some of the things you've seen by going into politics that maybe I might not have ever been exposed to. Like, what are some of the things that are super polarizing or that you have seen that maybe I don't have, purview to see? Kind of expose me to the world of politics and how things, what you've learned through that.
Well, just off the top of my head, some of the things that are polarizing everybody sees. So, social issues are what makes the news these days. It's what people battle on. But in reality, as an elected official, I'm now part of the Florida House of Representatives. You can have strong discussions that don't make the public news. And many of these discussions have to do with money. They have to do with what are we as a state, as a country, going to invest taxpayer funding in? And of course, when it comes to money and entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial principles, you often get competing and conflicting ideas. People, again, that are not business minded, haven't owned businesses, think differently about money and how to spend it and where to go and how things could be effective than people that aren't. And so you do see this in amongst parties. For example, the Republican Party, there are some entrepreneurs and there are some that aren't. But you do see amongst multiple parties here in the United States that there's extreme different types of thinking on both sides when it comes to these issues. And A lot of stuff never makes the news, but it is real. You take Florida, for example, it's, I believe, the seventh largest economy in the world, meaning just Florida alone is bigger than most countries. Just the amount of money that flows through Florida. So we're talking big budget, big decisions, and where you spend your money represents your values. On a family level, where a family spends their money represents their values. That doesn't change all the way up if you're spending billions of dollars. Where our country spends their money. We're seeing this right now, Josh, with the decision for, and I'm not going to go into the political stuff of this, but how we invest in other countries outside the U.S., how we deal with conflict outside the U.S., wars and whatnot. How we spend our money reflects the values of the administration. And half the country may or may not agree with how some of that happens. So that's where some of the political battles, really, if you back it all up, it's how's the money being spent, and that is a constitutional entrepreneurial topic. I'm excited about spending more time on it.
Yeah. So as you build out this idea, this movement of the constitutional entrepreneur and this community of other people who believe in the Constitution and that are proud to be an American and are thankful to be here building stuff. As you build this out, where do you see the vision of this? Like, what would you hope happens from all this that you are investing in building? Like, what's the end game?
Well, the end game is we put forth something that can help us all become better. I mean, that's the end game overall. Certainly, when you think about elected officials, when you think about leadership and what drives our lives, our country, our businesses, all of this stuff together, you can't predict when you get elected all the issues that you're going to deal with. Oftentimes when people are running races, and I ran a couple of races, I've lost one and I've won one, right? About to win a second one, a re-election. And so when we're electing people, and oftentimes elected people that are candidates want to act like they have all the answers to everything. And I get it. That's okay. We're dealing with some marketing, we're dealing with issues, and we're trying to share with people how we think. But the reality is that person, when they're running the race, they have no idea what kind of problems they're going to be dealing with once they get elected. So what you're really making a decision on is, how does that person think? The person I'm about to elect, how do they think about this issue? What are the principles that drive their behavior? And when push comes to shove, what are they willing to not compromise to get something done? And if we think about who we're electing from that standpoint, we actually process differently. And of course, sometimes you end up picking, you may not be happy with either candidate. You pick the one that's closer to you. And that does happen here. Yeah. But the goal of a podcast or a message like this is to help us, and even elected officials challenge their thinking, because push comes to shove, their belief system is what's going to drive their behavior. And their behavior is what's going to drive their decisions. And the decisions is what's going to drive legislation. And legislation is going to impact how we live and the country that we're in.
Yeah. What are some topics, as we round out today, of the intro of what is an entrepreneur, what is a constitutional entrepreneur? What are some topics that you think that we're going to dive into at later episodes and with other entrepreneurs and with other politicians? What topics do you think will be top of mind for you?
Well, here's an interesting one. Somebody asked me what I think the biggest challenge in politics is today. And again, there's a lot of answers for that. But if I were to look at something that I think would cause a chain reaction of positive things for us going forward, one of the biggest deficits, one of the biggest things that we deal with our elected officials, and the number one thing we could do is create an atmosphere of personal development and personal growth amongst our elected officials. Sometimes people get elected, they think they've arrived, they think they know everything. And those that enter that are elected that realize, okay, I want to keep growing, I want to keep learning, and I want to grow in the areas of leadership and personal development and people skills. And, what's lacking from our political world today is personal development. I go back to something I learned as a young man called the law of the lid. And the law of the lid basically says, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being hardly any influence, and 10 being the highest level of influence, as we grow our lid, as we grow ourselves, as we personally develop ourselves, we gain more influence over time. And lots of people go about obtaining influence outside of personal development. They go through it through money, through buying, and we end up problematic. But if people are developing their influence through who they are, who they become, what they're contributing, if they developed influence that way, then we have a whole different group of people that are now running the show. And so I think this messaging, this podcast will help people grow. It will challenge their thinking. It will offer them a different way to process how to go to the next level, and hopefully create some checks and balances. I mean, let's face it, not everything that makes sense goes through the political machine. And not everything that goes through the political machine makes sense.
For sure.
And relationships and how we deal with people really can override and trump everything, because this is a relationship-driven business, good and bad. Bad things happen because of tight relationships. So do good things. And the more we address these principles, on top of, we still have to be competent with our topics. We have to have data. We have to evaluate things. But we do need to do that much like an entrepreneur would that's running a business. The ebbs and flows of that business, they constantly have to know what's going on in their business. They constantly have to course correct. And if they course correct based on bad principles, they usually go out of business. Our government is bankrupt right now. It is not a great business. If it were a traditional business in the US, it would be out of business because traditional businesses can't print money. But so the more we operate within that vein of entrepreneurism, constitutional entrepreneurism, the better off we are.